Hello everyone, this is Tea Time Thoughts, and my name is Kaylin. This is technically the first episode of the podcast. I've recorded a couple of other ones before this, just sort of get familiar with the idea and the kind of format that I wanted to put together, but this is the one that I'm recording that has the official intro and everything. So for those of you that don't know me, I imagine at least for this one, a lot of the people that will be watching this will probably be people that I know, like my friends and family or things like that, the real MVPs. I am a recent graduate of BYU, Idaho, and I studied history and English, and this September I will be moving to London to start my graduate program studies for museum and gallery management at Kingston University, London. So I'm very excited about that. This has been a big dream of mine, and I'm really looking forward to it. I really love music. I love to play the piano. I love writing. I love traveling. I love to read. I'm essentially just a 90-year-old woman in the body of a almost 23-year-old woman. And I wanted to create this little corner of the internet to talk about art and history and culture, things kind of along those lines. I think those are very broad categories. There are all sorts of different things that we can discuss under those sort of categories, but I just wanted to have my little spot to talk about things that I enjoy or things that I find interesting. I'm not, really putting this together as any claim to fame or anything big like that. I just wanted to have my little corner and my cup of tea and just talk about the things that I like. And I thought this would be good motivation for me to go through my tea collection, because I have a lot of tea, but I kind of forget that I have a lot of tea, so I don't drink it all that much. But then when I do drink it, I'm like, oh yes, this is wonderful. I should do this all the time. So I figure I should stay true to brand with the name Tea Time Thoughts and make some tea every time I do a podcast episode. So today I thought I would do something a little fancy. I have lemon zinger tea, and this is my first time drinking it, so let's see. Oh, that's good. And I didn't completely scald my mouth this time, so this is fantastic. Very cool, very cool. Anyway, so basically the purpose of this is to just kind of share my thoughts and opinions intermixed with historical facts. It's probably not going to be anything especially groundbreaking. I'm definitely by no means some grand academic scholar who is going to unravel the mysteries of the universe for you, but if I can help you learn something that maybe you didn't know before, then I'm happy with that. And even if it's stuff you already knew, you just kind of felt like hanging around, I appreciate that. So when I was broadcasting some episode ideas with my friends, I actually had two friends suggest that I do my first discussion on Anne Boleyn, because she is a historical figure I've always found really fascinating, and I love her. I think that Anne Boleyn is such an interesting historical figure, and both of these friends who I met on my study abroad can testify to how excited I was to go visit the Tower of London. And at one point I made a little sign that said Anne Boleyn was innocent, then in parentheses just saying, and took a couple pictures with it around the sites. Which, looking back at that now, that's kind of ridiculous, because pretty much all of the charges that were made against her were either shown to not be true or to be very trumped up and over dramatized. But I should probably actually talk a little bit about who Anne Boleyn was, because some people will, they'll listen to this and they'll be like, oh yeah, Anne Boleyn, I know exactly who that is, or I know a lot about her, or they'll be like, who is that? I have no idea who that is. And I'm not judging either way, because there was a point where I didn't know who she was or know much about her, and this is a judgment-free zone. Honestly, sorry, little side tangent, but I think that if you're in the process of learning something new, that people shouldn't have the right to frown upon you if you're trying to learn. And if you know something that other people don't, you shouldn't hold that knowledge above them and treat them like they're lesser for not knowing something that you do, because we're all novices in various things. We were novices at some point, so let's just be nice to each other. Anyway, so Anne Boleyn was the second wife of King Henry VIII, and she was also the mother of Queen Elizabeth I. And she has somewhat of like a scandalous reputation in history, or at least she did for a very long time throughout history. It wasn't until about the 60s or 70s with the rise of gender studies and looking at things through more of like a perspective on women in history that we started to change our perception of her a bit. Her claim to fame is, I say this in a kind of air quotes way, seducing King Henry from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. And then Anne failed to give Henry a son, so he beheaded her and then married Jane Seymour, his third wife. And we tend to carry this image of her that was somewhat of a propagandized, I don't know if that's a word, but we're going to go with that, falsified image of her that played into her unpopularity with the king, because especially during the time, you're not going to disagree with the opinions of the king. It's a lot different from monarchy today. Back then, if you were a ruler, it's because, or the belief was, you ruled because God wanted you on the throne, and that was his will, and you have this divine role. So if you're refuting your monarch in some way, then you're essentially disagreeing with God's will, and that's a no-no. And that is quite possibly the most mild way to discuss heresy charges, I suppose. Saying that's a no-no. Yes, I am a grand scholar. To begin with, Anne was estimated to be born around 1501 to 1509. We don't have a concrete year for that, but that age difference between the years that she could have been born are really important, because by the time she married Henry, she wouldn't have been an especially young woman like Catherine Howard would have been, which that's a whole other issue. I'll probably do an episode on her, but that was a messed up issue. By the time she and Henry would have been married, she was married to Henry for about 3 years or so before her execution, and depending on her age during the time, it would have been a bit more difficult for her to have children, or maybe not necessarily more difficult, but her time to have children was running very thin compared to if Henry had married somebody, younger. So one thing that we tend to kind of associate with Anne is this very cosmopolitan French style about her. She was said to have popularized the French hood style at the English court, because she was educated in the Netherlands and France, and she actually served as a lady-in-waiting to Henry's sister, who was married to Francois I over in France, or Francis I, if we're going to anglicize it. And she became kind of I don't want to say hot commodity, but kind of a hot commodity around the English court when she did return, because she was really witty. She had this French style about her that was very different than the other women at the court. And what's interesting too is because we kind of tend to view her as a seductress or villainess, that we imagine her to be this great beauty, but it was actually probably more likely that she wasn't that beautiful, but she had a great personality, Her sister, Mary, was actually said to be the beauty of the family because she was a bit more plump, and she had paler skin and blonde hair, and that was the kind of the preference of the Renaissance style and the somewhat post-Renaissance style, to have a curvier woman who had blonde hair and blue eyes. That sort of ideal, and Anne didn't really fit that mold, but she was different and she stood out, and that sort of made her very popular, and that was something that helped her gain the king's attention in the first place. And interestingly enough, Henry had actually had an affair with Mary Boleyn, and Mary actually gave birth to a son that was fathered by Henry, and then Henry eventually moved his attentions on to Anne. So that's a little awkward. I'm just in awe of how good this tea is. Oh my goodness. I mean, both the gossipy tea and the lemon tea, but how hot is this gossip really if it's about 500 years old? Anyway, Henry could pretty much have any woman that he wanted at the court, and so he didn't really expect Anne to be any different, but Anne kept denying the king and eventually asserted that she wasn't going to, give him what he wanted unless she became his queen. And timing-wise, if this had been earlier in Henry's reign, this would have been absolutely ridiculous, because Henry and Catherine of Aragon, something that we overlook with them is that Henry and Catherine were actually very much in love. They had a very strong marriage, and Henry married Catherine even though it wasn't a very popular choice for him to do that. He really could have picked anybody else, but he wanted to marry Catherine, and it was very much a love match. But throughout the course of their marriage, Catherine gave birth to 6 children, and of those 6 children, only one child survived, and that was a daughter named Mary, who would go on to become Mary the First. And okay. I'm not a big fan of Mary. I'm 100% here for Elizabeth, but that's not the tea we're going to be spilling today. That's for another episode. So, obviously, this was a problem because Catherine didn't have a son to give Henry, and Henry was only the second king in the Tudor dynasty, and it was still very somewhat unstable. There were lots of other families that could easily assert their claims to the English throne, and with enough power and money, they could easily knock Henry off the throne and take it for themselves. So Henry wanted to have a dynasty that was solid, and to do that was to have a line of male heirs, because of course, nobody was going to take a woman seriously on the throne during that time. If you've seen Wolf Hall, there's this part where the Duke of Norfolk is talking about what would happen if the king died and there were no heir left behind. And they were talking about what would happen if Mary took the throne, Mary Tudor, and he just says, a woman on the throne of England, it just flies in the face of nature, which is very interesting when we look at how many powerful women we've had on the throne. But, it was a novel idea to them. It wasn't something that they really had precedence for, I guess. So it's easy for us to point to these great women and be like, well, of course a woman can rule. Look at these wonderful women there. But it was so much harder for a woman then to break the mold. Anyway, so Henry pursued Anne for about 8 years or so before their marriage ended up being able to take place. They wed in secret in 1532. Thomas Cranmer officially declared the king's old marriage annulled and void, basically. And then Anne became the king's lawful wife, and in June of 1533, Henry had Anne coronated at Westminster Abbey. And what's fascinating about this is he had her coronated with the crown jewels that the king would usually wear during his coronation, which sadly these jewels were destroyed during the English Civil War in the 1600s. But it's really interesting to consider this because it could be interpreted in so many different ways, because he could be saying that he's asserting Anne's right as his wife and his queen to have access to this kind of power. And that's something that is very interesting about Henry and Anne's relationship is the way he held her in his esteem was somewhat unique. He had a very interesting view of her. I wouldn't go so far as to say that they were equals, but Anne was very educated and Anne was bold, and I think that he saw her somewhat more as an equal than some of his other wives, because if we look at I did some research on this for a paper a while ago. If we look at the letters that Henry wrote to Anne, when he signs, he refers to himself as your humble servant, your kind and loving prince, things like that. But when he's writing a letter to Jane Seymour, he signs it off as your sovereign, your king. He's asserting his power over her. And that's not something that he did with Anne, but Henry had a very terrible jousting accident towards the end of his marriage to Anne that gave him a traumatic brain injury that very greatly changed his mood and his personality. He also had these terrible sores on his legs that would never really heal, and they always caused him a great deal of pain. So that was eventually what transformed Henry into the big, fat, angry, axe-wielding Henry VIII that we all think of. Another idea behind Henry crowning Anne with the official jewels is that Anne was pregnant during this coronation ceremony, and so perhaps it was less to crown Anne and more to crown the child that she was carrying, because Henry had so much faith that it was going to be a boy, because Anne promised him on various occasions that it was going to be a boy. There were like little notes that she would leave in her Book of Hours and Bible for Henry, where there are these illuminated photos of the infant Christ, and she's underlining various passages. And there's this one phrase that she wrote at one point: "Remember me when you do pray, that hope doth lead from day to day." And it's written on the same page as this little infant child. So the idea is, think of me and the hope that I will offer you. And what Henry hoped for the most was a son, so he had expected that from her. But as we know, or as they would find out in September of that year, September 7th to be exact, that Anne was not carrying a boy. In fact, she gave birth to a young girl named Elizabeth. And looking back now, we have reason to be excited because we're like, oh yes, that's Elizabeth, like she was so cool. But Henry had pretty much no reason to rejoice over that. He felt almost betrayed by this. He had it was written in, I don't know exactly what document, but there is a document where it was written to announce the birth of a prince, but prince ended up being scribbled out, and the birth of a daughter was instead added. And then Henry canceled the festival joust that he had planned in anticipation for the birth of this, longed for heir. As far as Anne's miscarriages, there's one at least that has been confirmed that would have taken place in early 1536. This one was especially tragic because when she miscarried this baby, it was said to have the appearance of a male. And, of course, it's absolutely tragic that not only she lost her child, but she lost the heir that could have saved her life and saved her position. As a matter of fact, the Spanish ambassador of the court, Eustache Chapuis, said that she had miscarried her savior. And I think that could have been very likely, but it's so easy to look at what could have happened in history, because you could really say anything could have happened. I don't know, that's a rabbit hole you could really go down for a while, but we know what happened, or in some cases we know what happened for the most part. That's the thing about history, is something that we take as fact one day, we could find out a week later that it wasn't true. Anyway, so Henry, actually, at the time Anne miscarried, it was at the same time of Henry's jousting accident. So this news, really, fills him with that Henry VIII rage that we tend to view him with. And he said he was afraid that God would not give him male children. And then he starts to point the finger at Anne, and he says that he was dishonestly led into this marriage, that she is an adulteress who's slept with hundreds of men, and therefore their marriage bed was tainted, and he kind of tasks the men around him to find a way to get rid of her. That's where our good buddy Thomas Cromwell comes in, who, if you've watched Wolf Hall, you'll know that he's a really interesting character. And Wolf Hall we have to take with a grain of salt because some of it is fictionalized, but we don't really know that much about Thomas Cromwell's life. He was the son of a blacksmith, and he worked his way up to become the right-hand man of the King of England. He clearly was very intelligent. He was very cunning. He had to work hard to get to where he got. And, as we learn later in history, that came with a price, because he ended up being one of Henry's victims, again, later in his life. But Cromwell played a significant role in helping put together this claim against Anne that she was guilty of treason, adultery, and incest. And the incest comes in the idea that she and her brother George had been intimate. And there were a few other men at the court that were accused as well. So let's test my knowledge. Let's see, we had William Brereton, we had Mark Smeaton, who's a court musician, we had, Francis, what's her last name? Francis someone. I cannot believe I can't remember this. I guess I've been reading too much about like Russian history lately, that I have kind of put my English history on the back shelf for a bit, and clearly I'm paying the price for it. We did have Henry Norris, who was one of the king's best friends, which, interesting little scandalous tidbit there. But the reason that Anne was somewhat accused of treason was that she had spoken freely of the king's death, and there was this code of chivalry that was somewhat popular during the time. And if we want to get into that a little bit, this code was a great advocate for, a very, like, the figures of a very masculine man and a very feminine woman who would engage in somewhat of like a flirtatious or romantic exchange. This was essentially what Anne and Henry were, or Harry. It's Henry Norris, but it's also Harry Norris. They just keep recycling the same names. It's hard to keep track. That's why Henry had 3 wives named Catherine. So Anne was asking Harry Norris why he wasn't married, and he, kind of gave some roundabout excuse, and she said, "I think you're not married because you look for dead man's shoes." And he asks for clarification, and she basically says, if something were to happen to the king, I believe you would want to marry me. And, this seems very weak to be called treason. I think that's what a lot of people would assume. That's what anybody who really hears that would think. They're just like, oh, she doesn't mean that she wants the king to die. She's not insinuating that she's got some grand plan to take down the dynasty. She's, just flirting with Harry Norris. And because Henry was looking for pretty much any reason he could, that was good enough, whatever. So Anne was arrested on May 2nd of 1536 and officially convicted on May 15th, along with the other men at the court, including George Boleyn and Harry Norris and Will Brereton and Mark Smeaton and Francis What's-His-Freaking-Face. I'm going to be so mad that I can't remember that. And so on May 19th, Anne was officially executed via... Sorry, I'm looking this up. I was going to wait. Francis Weston! Oh my gosh, Francis Weston. Okay. Okay, I can breathe easy now. Now I know. Oh, so on May 19th, Anne was executed via an expert swordsman that Henry VIII had brought in from France, because even though he was determined to get rid of her, he kind of wanted to extend a bit of a hand of mercy. Being beheaded by axe was usually not very reliable, as the executioners were often pretty drunk, because that's a gnarly business to have to deal with. And in the case of Margaret Pole, who would die a few years after Anne, it took 10 tries to get her head off. And like in the case of Mary Queen of Scots, it took 3 tries, and that's more suffering than you should have to deal with if you're about to die. So Henry brought in an executioner who was able to, behead her with one stroke of the sword. So it would, be a quick death. And so on the morning of May 19th, Anne rose to the scaffold and gave her last speech, which was actually very interesting because she prays that God saved the king and that the people essentially trust in his judgment, because she says there was never like a more kind and sovereign Lord, or like gracious and more merciful prince. And that's something that I find really fascinating, because how could you go in front of a crowd and say the person that is about to kill you is merciful? But I think that also alludes to Anne's character. And, oh my gosh, I can't believe I almost didn't talk about the final confession. So, a bit before Anne got executed, we're going to rewind a little bit there. I'm sorry, I should have outlined this better. I have an outline in front of me, but we're just kind of going where it goes naturally. I'm not being graded on this like I was my senior thesis presentation. So when Archbishop Thomas Cranmer took Anne Boleyn's final confession, she admitted to perhaps being unkind or being jealous at some points, but she never committed treason against the king, and she had been faithful. And in a final confession, especially because Anne Boleyn was somewhat of a religious figure, she was credited with trying to spread some Protestant ideas to Henry. Because she took her religion this seriously, she wouldn't lie under confession, because to lie under confession, they would, it was the belief that your soul would be damned to hell. So I don't see Anne trying to pass a lie off in the last minute. I think that shows an underlying goodness to her character. There were some things that she did that I don't agree with, or things that she said that I don't agree with either. But I don't think she deserves to be portrayed in. She tends to be portrayed in like one of two lights. She's either this awful witch who seduced the king and then got poetic justice, or she's this victimized virgin who was pushed into a role by the people around her, and she ended up just kind of stumbling into this awful position and then was executed for not knowing better. I think that she was too smart to fall into this sort of damsel in distress role, and I think that she had enough morality to not be this terrible witch that people portray her to be. I think that she was a person. She was very much a victim of her time as far as the fate that she met. If somebody committed actions like this today, we might not view them in a very positive light, but we by no means would murder somebody. As well as we know, she was most likely innocent of the charges that were against her, but her case was hopeless because Henry got what he wanted, and at the root of everything was this obsession to solidify his rule, which ends up becoming one of history's great ironies, that eventually when Henry gets his son, he only reigns for 6 years, and it's usually under the tutelage of a lot of corrupt advisors. But this daughter, Elizabeth, that Henry had with Anne, that he was so disappointed about, ends up becoming one of England's most famous and renowned rulers, who ruled for almost 45 years. And as tragic as Anne Boleyn's fate was, I'm at least grateful that we've been able to kind of give her some of the justice that she deserves. And yeah, I hope that gave you a little bit more insight into the situation. And if there are things that you don't agree with, or things that I've perhaps misquoted or gotten wrong, I'm always open to hearing amendments. I am by no means a leading expert in pretty much any of the fields that I discuss. It's, this is something I'm doing because I enjoy it. I'm always open to hearing other insights, and if there are any discussion topics you'd specifically like to hear in the future, I'm also very open to hearing about that too. I'd love to learn about something perhaps I don't know about and be able to flesh it out here. Thank you so much for listening. Hopefully I didn't scare you away, and you'll continue to come and have some tea with me and just learn a little bit about something. Yeah, I don't really know if I have a set outro yet or anything. I'll just, say goodbye, wish you all the best. This is Tea Time Thoughts, and I'm Kaylin. Have a good rest of your day.